Senator Saslaw would like to hear what the House has sent over. But as I'm very adroit at ignoring Senator Saslaw, I'd respectfully move we waive the reading of any communications from the House delegates.
I thank the Senator. Question is, shall the reading of the communication from the House of Delegates be waived? All in favor of waiving the reading will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 31, noes 6.
Ayes 31, noes 6. The reading of the communication from the House of Delegates is waived.
Returning to page 2, Senate Bill 1047.
Senior Senator from Chesapeake, Senator Cosgrove.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, Senate Bill 1047 is a bill requiring people who are on the sexual offender registry to have to report their presence to law enforcement at an emergency shelter. The governor's amendments basically do great harm to the bill. The governor took out any penalty for violation of this section of code. We had talked about it and gone to conference, and basically at the beginning it was a Class 1 misdemeanor. Basically, we took it down to a Class 3 misdemeanor, which is a $250 fine. The other amendment basically says that basically the sexual predator cannot be kept out of the emergency shelters, and really did a lot of damage to the bill as we dealt with it. Now, it was a close vote when we were here on the Senate floor. But I would ask that we reject all of the governor's amendments. And that being said, I ask that we do that because really what we have right now, you as a citizen of the Commonwealth of Virginia have a right to know if there's a sexual predator living within 1 mile of your home. But what we're doing here is basically saying that even law enforcement doesn't have a right to know, because they can't use the sexual registry list, if anybody is in an emergency shelter sleeping next to your son or daughter. So this bill was worked out in conference. It came out of the Senate and the House. And I would ask that with the recommendation that be rejected, I ask that we accept the amendments.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Western Fairfax, Senator Marsden rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to speak in favor of the governor's amendments.
Senator has the floor.
The issue you have here, what the governor did is you still have to report it to the people at the shelter that you're on the registry. We removed the Class 3 misdemeanor because that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on an individual who may be there with family, with young children. Yes, they're on the registry. But they're nervous, they're scared, maybe their house is being flooded out, and now they're being asked to report that, and without reporting, they have committed a Class 3 misdemeanor. A lot of folks on the registry, a whole lot of folks on the registry are on probation. By not reporting it and trying to get your family in there and staying with your minor children and supporting your family might put you in a situation where you violated probation and you're going to have a prison sentence put down on you because you didn't make that report. And here's the thing, is that what the original bill did that I had some issues with is that it doesn't require any pre-planning. It just says you show up and they can keep you out until they figure out what's safe. Well, here you got people trying to run a shelter, trying to deal with all the confusion and the chaos that's going on, and you have no plan for dealing with these folks. And what the governor's amendment does is require you to have a procedure put in place ahead of time so you know how to deal with these situations. So you have somebody showing up with their family, a minor child, you forget to report that you're on the registry, you've committed a Class 3 misdemeanor, and folks on the registry don't know the rules. They're not even allowed to go on the internet to find out what the rules are. I've had bills in the past that have been defeated to try to make it mandatory that the Department of Corrections and the state police give people information about what the rules are. So this is a situation, it's unconscionable to turn people away in this circumstance. The bill still requires that they report. It just takes off the penalty, and it requires them to have a procedure in place to make sure that when these occurrences take place in life-threatening situations, that people are not turned away and the shelters are prepared for these folks. So I'd ask you to support the governor's amendments.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Fairfax City, Senator Peterson rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speak to the amendment.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, you know, this is one of these bills and one of these situations that often plays out a little bit differently in real life than the sort of the stereotypes that we have when we hear the speeches on this floor. And I'll give you an example. A couple weeks ago, I was approached by a former law partner of mine who has a family friend who is a sex offender and wanted to know if they could get a pardon or somehow get this off their record. Well, it turns out they cannot. This is actually a woman. She's in her mid-40s. She has 2 teenage children and basically had sex with a teenager when she was in her 20s and was convicted of statutory rape. Without naming any names, anytime that family moves to a new location, she has to be registered as a sex offender. Okay? These are some of the people we're talking about. So when you have all these sort of sexual predators and these visions and stereotypes, it actually plays out a lot differently. I think the governor's amendment, I'd rather the governor just vetoed the bill, but he didn't do that. I think the governor's amendments at least put a little bit more humanity into the process. Frankly, in my opinion, this whole code section needs a major rewrite, but that's going to have to wait for another day. But I ask that we pass this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. With the recommendation that they be rejected, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations to Senate Bill 1047 be agreed to? All in favor, the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 18, noes 20.
Ayes 18, noes 20. The governor's recommendations are rejected.
On page 4, Senate Bill 1485.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do not support the governor's amendment, so I would defer to someone else to make the motion.
Or, okay. Senator from Petersburg, Senator Dance.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to amend the bill in accordance with the recommendations of the governor.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you. Speaking to the recommendations, the governor's amendment to this legislation would remove one representative from the Virginia Association of Community Rehabilitation Programs and add a person with a disability who is employed in a competitive integrated setting. My understanding is that the purpose of this amendment was to sort of like put peace in the valley as far as 3 groups that would be a part of the steering committee that would be addressing extended employment services, that they would have more balanced representation. There was a feeling that 2 organizations had more representation than the third, and that this, by putting in a person that has a disability, which this is all about, an actual person that has a disability, not just a family member, taking one off one committee, put it on this one, would resolve an issue within those organizations that are members that petition the governor to reach peace in the valley. And that was the intention of the amendment. And I would ask that the governor's amendment be upheld.
Thank you, Senator. 4% from Augusta, Senator Hanger rise.
Then I'd like to speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. I rise to speak in opposition to the governor's proposed recommendations on this bill. Senate Bill 1485 is an important issue for individuals that are under our Employment First opportunities that directs the Department for Aging and Rehabilitative Services to make referrals for any employment services organization that provides competitive or commensurate wages that are eligible to receive state-funded long-term employment support services. Mr. President, members of the Senate, this was contentious during negotiations on both the Senate and the House, but an agreement was reached which basically on the Senate side was unanimously supported by this body, and on the House side was unanimously supported by that body. And there has been in the past seemingly somewhat of more of an advocacy for the competitive wage employment. For those of us that with the terminology sometimes is confusing, there are individuals that have disabilities that are very capable of, just like you and I, working in a competitive environment for prevailing wage rates. There are other individuals with disabilities that require wraparound services, and they are very capable of a work environment. In fact, they enjoy a work environment that gives them the capacity to be contributing citizens, but they cannot produce in a competitive wage environment. So you have places like, I used to be president of a place called Transition Industries, which provided services for these types of individuals where they could contract together in what some people would refer to as sheltered workshops. That part is intact, and I discussed this morning with the governor. What is in question is the steering committee. The steering committee was balanced with these ESOs statewide so that there would be equal representation. The one category that deals with the non-competitive placements has many more entities around the state to work with. Happened just yesterday morning, was at a location for one called Friendship Industries, which works does contract work for one of the major employers in the area there in the valley. And the people that go there, they come there for work and they're productive citizens, and it keeps them off of Medicaid and other types of public support. What the governor proposed to do was to balance it by taking one position away that had been negotiated to be there, and replace it with an individual with disability that in a competitive environment. I would submit to you, and I discussed this with the governor this morning, he has the ability to do that. He has 2 appointments, and there are no strings attached to those appointments. So he can, without these amendments, make this appointment. So, Mr. President, I would certainly ask, because of the balance, the critical balance we have here, that these amendments be rejected.
Thank the senator. For what purpose, Senator from the junior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator D. Staff Rise.
Mr. President, this is a very important program. I fully agree with the good senator from Augusta, and would like to say that this truly gives our special needs individuals a purpose. It gives them a reason to get up in the morning, to go to work. It truly gives them that purpose. So with that, I would like everybody to reject the governor's amendment on this. Thank you very much.
Thank the senator. There is now a substitute motion with the recommendation that it be rejected. Okay, no, we only have one motion before us. Question is, shall the governor's recommendations to Senate Bill 1485 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senator desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 17, noes 21.
Ayes 17, noes 21. The governor's recommendations are not agreed to.
On page 6, Senate Bill 1579.
Senator from Roanoke County, Senator Suderline.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that the Senate pass the governor's recommendations by for the day.
Without objection, governor's recommendations will go by for the day.
On page 10, Senate Bill 1716.
Senator from Rockingham, Senator Obenshain.
Mr. President, I rise first and request that we initially take up amendments 1, 4, 7, 10, 13, and 19.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I would move that we adopt those amendments. And speaking to those amendments,
the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, this is the what has colloquially come to be known as the Interstate 81 legislation. It is, in fact, at this stage, much more than that. And first of all, I do want to say a couple of things about the process. I want to thank the Governor and Secretary Valentine in particular for their work over the past year and focus on Interstate 81. Senator Carrico has been intimately involved in this process as well. And it's been an arduous path that this has taken. And this set of amendments deals with a portion of the funding mechanism. I am glad that I can support a part of this. I was not enamored with what we walked in here with at the beginning of the year, but I was committed to a process. And this process went for a year, and there were stakeholders who were at the table, and we learned a lot about how our interstates are funded and about the equities of how cars and trucks are paying for the interstates. And, you know, quite frankly, we members here have heard an awful lot about the public health and safety crisis that we really have along Interstate 81, and I won't belabor that, but fact of the matter is that there is seldom a day in which there is not a multi-mile, multi-hour backup along Interstate 81. And unlike some of our other interstates, it's not just a congestion-oriented issue where you have cars merging to get into a tunnel or through a narrow portion of 66. It's because there's a fiery crash, and very frequently there's serious injuries or deaths. So this is a very serious issue that needs to be resolved, and people along the Interstate 81 corridor depend on it every day for commerce, for safety, for transporting their families, for doing business. And I'm glad that this process is moving forward. The portion of this bill that are the amendments that I support deal with the way that we allocate the cost of constructing and improving highways in Virginia. And what we learned through this process is that our highways in Virginia are really utilized somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% of the utilization is by tractor trailers, heavy trucks. Probably 90+% of the wear and tear on our interstate highways is caused by heavy trucks. But heavy trucks are paying about 10% of the cost of construction and maintenance of our interstate highways in Virginia. And that structural imbalance is something that we really need to look at, and we have looked at in the course of this process. And one aspect of how we can make an adjustment is really a user fee, and that's the registration fees. And our registration fees for heavy trucks in Virginia, and this is not cars, but this is heavy truck registration fees in Virginia, are much lower than the average along the Interstate 81 corridor. In some instances, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of a third as much as other states. And these are registration fees that are allocated between all the states in which these trucks drive. And these amendments that I've pulled out of the block and initially am moving adoption of makes an adjustment to the registration fees for these heavy trucks along the Interstate 81 corridor and brings us closer to the average of states along the corridor. It does not bring us to the average. It brings us closer. Mr. President, with that, I would respectfully submit that this is a start to solving some of the transportation issues that we have along the Interstate 81 corridor. I don't believe that there's any perfect solution. No solution is going to be something that all of us are going to agree with. I'm not a big fan of the regional gas tax, whether it's in Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia, or the Shenandoah Valley. And as a consequence, I can't support that. But I do support the adjustment of this user fee and the adjustment of the structural imbalance that exists, and would ask the members to adopt these 6 amendments that have been offered to this legislation.
Thank the senator. For what purpose, Senator from Roanoke City, Senator Edwards, rise?
Mr. President, I agree. I support this part of the governor's amendments, and I support the entire governor's amendments. But I'll reserve the right to talk about the other parts later.
Senator, has the floor.
At this point, I would appreciate what the senator from Rockingham said, and I agree with most of everything he just said. I go further than he does, of course. And I'm glad, I want to thank the governor, first of all, for taking this up at this session. I also want to thank the secretaries, Valentine, and Deputy Secretary Donahue, for the work they've done since we left to put this in a better posture than it was. I was on the conference committee that didn't quite come to a conclusion. We were close to it, but we learned a lot this session, and we learned a lot last year. The VDOT did a series of public hearings that come up with plans for fixing I-81. Of course, this goes beyond I-81. This
bill be removed from the block.
Senate Bill 1150, Senate Bill 1156, Senate Bill 1240.
Mr. President.
Senator from Loudoun, Senator Black.
Yes, could Senate Bill 1156 come out of the block, please?
Without objection, bill be removed from the block.
Mr. President.
Senator from Spotsylvania, Senator Reeves.
Senate Bill 1240 on page 21 come out of the block, please.
Without objection, that bill be removed from the block.
Senate Bill 1251, Senate Bill 1674.
Mr. President.
Senator from Spotsylvania, Senator Reeves.
If I can request 1674 on 22 come out of the block, please.
Without objection, the bill be removed from the block.
And Senate Bill 1782.
Question is, shall the Senate bills be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor, in a block? That is all bills except for the bills that have been...
Mr. President.
Yes.
Parliamentary inquiry. What is the motion that is being made right now?
The bills were placed in a block originally.
To sustain the veto?
On a voice vote? Hold on one second. Okay. Come to order, please. And so, again, to reset, the bills have been placed in a block. On this recorded vote, if you desire to override the governor's veto, you would vote yes. If you want to sustain the veto, you vote no. Okay, we clear? We're all good? Great. Okay, so that's the vote that we're about to take right now. Again, to override the veto, vote yes. Sustain the veto, vote no. Okay. Question is, shall the Senate bills be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor, in a block? That is all bills except for the bills that were removed from the block. All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 20, noes 18.
Ayes 20, noes 18. The motion fails. And to be clear, that means the governor's vetoes are sustained with regard to those bills in the block.
Returning to page 19, Senate Bill 1027.
Senior Senator from Richmond City, Senator Sturtevant.
Mr. President, I move that Senate Bill 1027 be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor, and speaking to that.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, this is the catastrophic health insurance plan bill that passed this body 38-2 this session. It passed this body last year 40-0. This is the health insurance plan that is ACA approved. It is an ACA health care plan. It is a plan that covers pre-existing conditions. It is a plan that covers all of the ACA's essential health benefits. And it's even a plan that covers 3 primary care visits every single year and preventative care like flu shots and vaccines for free or with a small copay. And it is a plan that is currently offered on the health care exchanges, but it's only offered to those who are 30 years old or younger. And so what this legislation does, and this body has now voted to approve twice, is to simply give the health insurance companies in Virginia the option to offer these plans to Virginians of any age. We have a lot of Virginians in all of our districts who may not be able to afford the bronze plan or the silver plan or the gold plan or the platinum plan. But this is a plan that has a lower monthly premium and, as I mentioned, covers those pre-existing conditions and the essential health benefits, but it's got a high deductible. And so it is a plan that is right for some people. It may not be right for everyone. But this is a plan that will be an option for those who don't otherwise qualify for the ACA subsidies and who don't otherwise have access to health insurance through their employer or through Medicaid or Medicare or otherwise. And therefore, I would ask that Senate Bill 1027 be passed in the enrolled form that passed this body.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Alexandria, Senator Eben rise.
Speak in opposition to the motion.
Senator has the floor.
The bill with the extremely high deductibles in excess of $7,000 it's about more than the flu shots and things that are covered with the annual examinations. It places consumers at the risk of being underinsured in a larger insurance pool, leading to increased marketplace premiums for the population at large. But the extremely high deductibles give a false assurance that people have health care. They don't have health care until they have $7,000 in expenses, which may discourage them from seeking health care. And it's true that people younger than 30 who qualify for a hardship or affordability exemption can currently buy this kind of plan, but this is really to seek an exemption. It's not something that's currently offered, and it's to seek a federal waiver to allow this. And I would encourage the body to vote no, or to vote no.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose is the Senator from Henrico, Senator Dunham rise?
Mr. President, I will be brief, but I'd like to speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
I just really feel compelled to say something. This is a matter of allowing our constituents to choose their health plan as opposed to us limiting the choices they may have. It's ridiculous. People already have very high deductibles. Some of the deductibles in the individual marketplace are as high as $10,000. They're already not getting health care. All insurance plans involve disclosures that explain what your responsibility will be in the plan. This is within the Affordable Care Act. We must allow our consumers to make their own choices. They are very capable. And I would ask that you override this veto because it's really pretty egregious that we're limiting the choices and mandating that they have the most expensive premiums that they ever imagined they could have.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Arlington, Senator Favola rise?
Mr. President, I speak in favor of the governor's veto.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to remind the ladies and gentlemen of the Senate that as we offer more and more boutique plans and individuals select plans that fit their specific health status, it reduces the size of the insurance pool. Individuals who have pre-existing conditions need to participate in a large pool so the insurance premium is affordable. What we're doing is we're offering these plans where people self-select, and we're narrowing the pool where many of us should be participating, so those who are really ill and would need very expensive health care can afford to access it. We should really be about trying to provide insurance at an affordable rate to everyone. For that reason, I ask you to sustain the governor's veto. Thank you.
Thank the senator. For what purpose, Senator from Roanoke City, Senator Edwards, rise.
Mr. President, this would I urge that we sustain the governor's veto.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, what this does is the governor vetoed this bill because these are basically junk health insurance policies, and it totally undermines the whole concept of insurance, which is broad in the base. And what this would do is put people at risk of being underinsured, and it would fragment the risk pool, and it would be bad for everyone in the long run. So I urge the body to sustain the governor's veto. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator, for what purpose, Senator from King George, Senator Stewart, rise.
Speak to the measure, Mr. President.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, that's an interesting assertion by the gentleman from Roanoke, because I can tell you something, the risk pool is already fragmented. And the young people who can't afford to pay these exorbitant premiums aren't participating. It has completely undermined the entire philosophy of the Affordable Care Act. Everybody in this room knows it. People on this side, people on that side know it. Everybody stood up, they've talked about it, they've pointed out the problems of a very well-intended program. It didn't work. It's kicked people out of health care insurance, and that's where we find ourselves. And each one of us in here has commented on it and how we want to try to find ways to let Virginians have health insurance. Some people don't need all the broad spectrum of coverage. You can't force people to buy something that they don't want or that they can't afford. So now what you have is a catastrophic plan. It's hospitalization. That's what it is. It's what I grew up with. It's what many of you all in here grew up with. You went to the doctor. If you couldn't afford to pay him, you paid him $5 a week or a month or whatever you could till you paid him off. If you went to the hospital, you were covered so you'd end up going bankrupt. It's a very simple thing. This would give Virginians a chance to participate and have health insurance that's affordable. It's what we all want. This bill passed this chamber 38-2. 38-2. And look, I think the world of the governor, and everybody in here knows that, but he's flat wrong on this one. We have got to give Virginians an alternative because they don't have it now. So I hope you all will vote the same way you voted before and override this veto, because let me tell you something, Virginians are watching and they want choices, and they have been screaming for choices, and by God, we better give them a choice.
Thank the senator. For what purpose is the senator from James City County, Senator Norment, rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of overriding the governor's veto.
Senator has the floor.
I think everyone in this body probably knows that health care is not the area that I focus in, and I do not pretend to embrace a high degree of expertise on it. But I will say this is probably the second most baffling and perplexing decision that this governor has made, in my humble perspective. And it's baffling to me that a professional health care provider would want to try to chill the access of Virginians to health care alternatives. And in this particular piece of legislation, I think it's important, if I'm correct, that it pertains to those who are 30 or younger. And that group is not the group that is bearing the exorbitant health care expenses like people my age. And that is just an actuarial fact. And I just is beyond me while this and some other alternative approaches are so vehemently objected by this administration. And you talk about affordable health care. I'm not an expert on this, but I have gone and looked at the marketplace. People are looking at $5,000, $7,000, and $10,000 deductibles by insurance. I mean, the deductibles under the Affordable Health Care Act. And then on top of that, they're having premiums anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 a month. And so it is just transparent, if not a fallacious argument, to suggest that what we have in place is a more economical approach where we are trying in 1027 to capture the group that has the least demand on health care expenses. It is totally perplexing to me.
For what purpose does the Senior Senator for Richmond City, Senator Sturdivant, rise?
If no one else wishes to speak, Mr. President.
Do any other senators wish to be heard on this bill? Seeing none, Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, just 2 points of clarification. This is not underinsurance. This is an ACA plan. This covers all of the essential health benefits that every other single ACA plan covers, period. It has a higher deductible, yes. So you may have a $7,000 deductible for a catastrophic plan instead of a $5,000 deductible for a bronze plan. But you have far less expensive monthly premium payments, and that is where the challenge is for average, everyday, middle-class Virginians, are the exorbitant monthly premiums that they have to pay for these more expensive plans. This is a more affordable option that allows for cheaper, less expensive monthly premiums. The second clarification, and I confirm this with the Bureau of Insurance today, that the entire there is one risk pool for all of the ACA plans. There is not one risk pool for catastrophic, there's not one risk pool for bronze and one for silver and one for gold. They are all in the very same risk pool. And so what this does is it allows people to actually come in to the risk pool, to broaden it, to support it, to grow it, and that is good for everyone. And so with that, Mr. President, again, I would request that the Senate bill be passed in its enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor.
Thank you, Senator. Question is, shall Senate Bill 1027 be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 22, noes 16.
Ayes 22, no 16. The motion fails.
On page 20, Senate Bill 1156.
Senior Senator from Loudoun, Senator Black.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that Senate Bill 1156 be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor. And speaking to the measure.
Senator has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very, very basic bill. All that it says is that localities are prohibited from enacting any sort of rule or legislation that deliberately, intentionally restricts enforcement of federal immigration laws. It does not require any locality to take any affirmative action It does not require them to spend one penny on anything. They don't have to enact any rules. They don't have to coordinate with anybody. It only prevents them from passing an ordinance, procedure, or policy that is deliberately intended to restrict the enforcement of federal immigration law. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that we should permit localities to be in the business of countermanding federal law, federal statutes. And so it's very simple. And I really think that it's sort of a fundamental rule that we, as a legislature, as a state legislature, do not simply throw ourselves in the path of the federal government and deliberately countermand federal law. And so I would just ask that the ladies and gentlemen here override this veto so that we can simply remain in compliance with federal law. Thank you.
Thank the senator. For what purpose, Senator from Arlington? Senator Favola, rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to ask the body to sustain the governor's veto.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Right now, local governments can't pass laws that would actually prohibit the work of the federal government. But local governments may voluntarily enter agreements with ICE to determine what appropriate role they may want to play and what the role of ICE might be and how local government continues to provide security and safety to its residents. This is a solution looking for a problem. Our local governments spend a lot of time and energy working with their police forces, trying to build trust with those whom they serve. It is very important for safety to really take hold in a community that every sector of the community trusts the police, that immigrants, people of all colors and races feel engaged, feel like they can turn to the police. When you pass legislation like this, the message it sends is very damaging, and I would say very inappropriate and not necessary. It's simply not necessary. So since we have that local autonomy, since some local governments have entered agreements with ICE, since this is a solution looking for a problem, and please, we are a diverse state. We should be a welcoming state, and I know many parts of our community we are welcoming. I ask the body to sustain the governor's veto. So that would be a red vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the senator. Question is, shall Senate Bill 1156 be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 20, noes 18.
Ayes 20, noes 18. The motion fails.
On page 21, Senate Bill 1240.
Senator from Spotsylvania, Senator Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that SB 1240 be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor. And speaking to that,
Senator has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the second year in a row you've heard this bill and you voted for it. 2 years in a row you voted 40-0. So a lot of the same talking points that my seatmate talked about with catastrophic plans applies to short-term duration insurance, but I want to give you some updated numbers that I literally got on Friday. Right now, there are 29 million Americans that are still uninsured. They don't qualify for the subsidies under ACA. They do make a living. They make a pretty good living, but they don't qualify for those subsidies. Those people that would qualify for short-term plans are the uninsured, individuals between jobs are waiting for employer coverage, recent graduates, individuals transitioning out of welfare, young adults leaving their parents' plans, and retirees not eligible for Medicare. And that's a big swath of folks. Right now in Virginians, we're finding health care plans that work for them if we can do short-term duration insurance, and with premiums 50 to 80% lower than individual market plans right now. I had some recent numbers, and I think this is interesting data for the folks who represent the Virginia Beach area. By allowing short-term duration plans in the Virginia Beach area, they are 60% cheaper than individual market plans and more than half the cost, less than $200 per month. They're designed to give consumers as much choice as possible. And I think that's what we're all getting at, and why we understand this, is that with more choice, you get more savings, and we find that we get lower premiums. And, you know, I've heard about what it will do to ACA. This is a very small portion of people that we're talking about with the overall pool. And as an insurance guy, I understand risk and risk tolerance and how they do these things. But we have people falling through the cracks. And I'll tell you a little bit of personal about it. I have great insurance. I'm lucky that I have an employer that offers it. But my deductible is $5,000. But it's through an employer plan. And when we reach that, then we start having to pay out of pocket as well. But not everybody has that. And these are for those people that are in those categories that fall there. And, you know, we all get it. I understand it's an election year. I understand the talking points. But if we don't do something for these folks, the people that I continuously get emails from in the Albemarle area where they had a 300% increase in the individual market, they can't afford it. So they're uninsured. So they're still walking into the ER. They're still getting covered under the I forget what that's called, but we were talking about that. Certificate of Public Need, right, under that. And so it's still costing us more money. And there's an option here to allow individuals to go into the market, even if it's short term, and get the coverage that they need, that they want, and pay for that and pay lower premiums. Some insurance is better than no insurance. We require that when you drive your car. You got to have a basic amount of insurance so if you get in an accident. I think we need to offer this plan. I kind of know where this is going today, but I think we really need to have a real dialogue about how we take care of those Virginians who are working hard, that are trying to get coverage, that need that insurance. And I would ask that the chamber move that SB 1240 be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Southern Fairfax? Senator Barker, rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak to the measure that's before.
Thanks, Senator. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition to the proposal to override the governor's veto on this particular proposal here. I do agree with the senator from Spotsylvania on various aspects of things. We need to study these types of things and make sure that we are providing reasonable options for people. I think this is one that right now, in terms of how it's structured, goes too far in terms of what it does or may not cover in many situations. If you look at the bill as the enrolled version of this, what it says is this coverage is not required to comply with certain federal market requirements. So it basically notifies you up front that there is not comprehensive coverage that is required to be provided here. And it goes on to say, be sure you are aware of any exclusions or limitations regarding coverage of pre-existing conditions. They are not required to cover pre-existing conditions or health benefits such as hospitalizations, emergency services, maternity care, preventive care, prescription drugs, and mental health and substance abuse disorder services. Your policy may have lifetime and annual dollar limitations. So it basically unwinds virtually everything that was designed in the Affordable Care Act to provide more comprehensive coverage and have equity of risk in terms of those situations. It's not unusual that many of these short-term plans do not provide many of the services that are part of the essential health benefits and have other limitations in there. And in a large majority of situations, they don't cover pre-existing conditions because they don't want to provide coverage for pre-existing condition if you're coming in for only a short period of time and are likely to be using extensive services for that. What I can tell you is that we need to focus on the long-term goal, which is to get as many people covered in an affordable manner under health insurance, which is why I supported the efforts of the senator from Henrico on the association plans to have those that not be approved, to not approve the governor's amendments here. Here, I think that we need to support the governor's veto here because of the limitations that are provided in many of these plans, but to continue the discussion as to how we can make sure that everybody has comprehensive coverage. What I can tell you is that in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where Governor Romney got basically the predecessor to the Affordable Care Act approved, what they have done there is, because they got a head start on the rest of us, they have just almost eliminated the number of people who lack health insurance coverage. They are down to about 2% of the population that doesn't have health coverage, and they have almost exclusively comprehensive services, coverage of services there. That's what we need to be aiming for, moving in that direction. I don't think this is the mechanism to get us there, but I'm certainly open to discussion on this as we move forward on consideration of things in the long term. And I would urge rejection of the motion to override the governor's veto.
Thank you. Senator, for what purpose, Senator from Spotsylvania, Senator Reeves, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. No one wishes to speak. I'd wish to close it up.
Do any other senators wish to be heard on Senate Bill 1240? Seeing none, Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do appreciate my colleague, the Senator from Southern Fairfax, comments about continuing to work on this, but I'd like to summarize by saying, you know, we have choices all day long. We can choose what kind of TV we want to watch, what kind of cable channels we want to get. When you're buying car insurance, you have all kinds of options on what kind of coverage you want and how much, and we do expect minimum coverage on that. And right now, we're in a position where we're not giving anybody a minimum coverage because they can't qualify anywhere other than to walk into an ER. And I understand that it doesn't cover some of the things that the ACA covers. That's why we have the plan, because that allows us to keep the cost lower. But I think educated consumers can go in and say, look, this is what I need. I can make that choice. Is it perfect? By no means. No. Is this a solve to everything else? No. It's short-term duration insurance, hopefully to cover that gap so we can get them in to ACA, or we can get them into an employer-sponsored plan. And so it's not perfect by any stretch, and I think we all know that. That's why we voted it out of here 40-0 each year. The commission that the governor put together didn't come out with any real recommendations, so we put it forward again and hopeful that we could get there. And I would hope that those of us on the other side of the aisle as well would seriously consider, how do we switch this? How do we make it better? How do we get there? And include some of those in our short-term duration insurance plan so we can get to these individuals transitioning out of welfare, these young adults that my colleague and his catastrophic care were trying to cover. Because we're leaving now about 29 million Americans uninsured, and a good portion of that, they're still in Virginia. And with that, I would renew my motion, Mr. President.
Thank the senator. Question is, shall Senate Bill 1240 be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 20, noes 18.
Ayes 20, noes 18. The motion fails.
On page 22, Senate Bill 1674.
Senator from Spotsylvania, Senator Reeves.
Mr. President, this is in the same posture. I move that 1674 be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor. Speaking to that.
Senator has the floor.
Members of the body, this also came out of the chamber, I think with 2 voting against it, but it was part of an option that I'd come up with, being in the insurance business, trying to figure out how we can take care of at least one of the objections that we had last year from the House about offering guaranteed insurability once you had a limited duration plan. And this would be an optional rider that you could get, that companies that would offer this short-term duration insurance would have to provide, so we could make sure that those folks, as part of the ACA, didn't lose that, because I think we're all in agreement that we need to cover pre-existing conditions. So once you got rated into the plan and you had one of these plans, you could get this additional rider on your coverage, and you would have that insurance as long as you fulfilled the contract obligations. So this goes right along with it. I think it's one step forward, and we all agreed to it. So I think it's probably in the same posture, but I would renew my motion.
Thank the Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Southern Fairfax? Senator Barker, rise.
Mr. President, to speak to the measure here.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, the issues here are similar to what was discussed on the previous matter, and part of the concern I think that a lot of people have as it relates to this extension of that coverage is that if you have people with certain basically you have people who get coverage and have significant expenditures in a short-term plan, it becomes difficult for the insurance plan to be able to be viable in that situation, and this would just perpetuate that by extending that provision where you have low premiums that do not cover the cost that are there and provide some risk to the overall operation of that type of plan. What we need to do is to make sure we have solid plans that are sustainable over time and that will provide the comprehensive coverage that people need to address both situations they have when they come into the plan with pre-existing conditions, but also what it may develop during the time period that they're covered.
Thank the Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to Senate Bill 1674? Seeing none, the question is, shall Senate Bill 1674 be passed in the enrolled form, notwithstanding the objections of the governor? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk, close the roll.
Ayes 20, noes 18.
Ayes 20, noes 18. The motion fails.
House bills with governor's recommendations.
Senator from James City County, Senator Norment.
Page 23.
Mr. President, I admit I have been a total failure in trying to expedite matters today by taking them up in the block, because the block becomes comparatively de minimis when I see what is left, so let's just run through them.
House Bill 1620. The House has agreed to amendment number 6 and number 15.
Senator from Fauquier, Senator Vogel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Having previously described this bill, which is identical to Senate Bill 1055, I would like to respectfully request that following the House's action on 6 and 15, which is identical to what we did, that then we, with the motion that we accept it, I move that we reject the governor's other amendments.
They're not before us.
Okay. Apparently, other amendments are not before us.
Oh, sorry.
So only Amendment 6.
Oh, sorry. Then I move the adoption of Amendments 6 and 15. How about that?
That works.
Thank you.
The Senator. Question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to Amendments 6 and 15 for House Bill 1620 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk, close the roll.
Ayes 37, noes 0, Rule 36-1.
Ayes 37, noes 0, Rule 36-1. The governor's recommendations, 6 and 15, are agreed to.
House Bill 1661, the House rejected the governor's amendments. House Bill 1700
has not been received.
Has not been received yet.
Page 41.
Page 41. House Bill 1719, the House agreed to the governor's amendments.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Fauquier, Senator Vogel.
I rise, Mr. President, asking that we adopt the governor's amendment and speaking to that motion.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. What this bill does is it says that if you are in an area, a locality, a town with a population of less than 25,000 people, you have to comply with our regular code sections regarding campaign financing and reporting obligations only, and this is what this bill does, if you have more than $25,000 in receipts or expenditures. And what the governor did was he clarified something that's very critical that was absent in this, and that is for what period of time are you setting this threshold? And so right now we've just added the language that says in an election cycle. So with that inartful explanation, I would ask that we please adopt the governor's amendments.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard regarding House Bill 1719? Seeing none, question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 1719 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 37, no 0.
Ayes 37, no 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 1911, the House agreed to the governor's amendments.
Who wants to field this one? Senator from James City County, Senator Norment.
No. Mr. President.
For-Purpose Senator from Prince William County, Senator McPike rise.
Mr. President, I move that we agree to the governor's amendments and speaking to the motion.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, what this does is expand upon the moving over law that we passed, and it includes the use of amber lights in this provision of the code. And so it's one of those important things where we have VDOT workers and others that actually are utilizing amber lights as well as tow when they're trying to remove obstacles and hazards from the roadway. This adds those provisions to the law to increase safety of some of our state workers and other workers who are also in these sort of same conditions on our interstate highways. It is an important measure that we adopt, and I appreciate the time.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard regarding the House Bill 1911?
Mr. President.
Senator from Grayson, Senator Carrico.
Speaking to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, members of the body, the reason that the section in which the governor has put back into the bill was taken out is that now we're making on first offense it be a Class 1 misdemeanor of reckless driving. The section that was taken out that was put back in under the governor's recommendation is the one that has the amber light section. And we have created a huge Christmas tree effect. As a matter of fact, if you were to go, if you weren't to move over for a neighborhood watch vehicle under the section in which has been put back in, it would be a violation of a Class 1 misdemeanor. By leaving that out, we would have left it a traffic infraction, but not a Class 1 misdemeanor. And there's a whole litmus of vehicles in that section, funeral vehicles, trucks that are escort vehicles, like I said, neighborhood watch vehicles, records. They're all listed in that same section, and that was the reason it was taken out. And also, just kind of a reminder when we spoke about this, a lot of the times when wreckers are on the scene, there's either a law enforcement officer or fire and rescue there, and those are covered. So it would be automatically a Class 1 if those vehicles were on the scene with the records if they didn't move over. And the recommendations put that whole list back in, and that was the reason that we didn't support it and took that section out.
Thank you, Senator. Question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 1911 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 32, noes 6.
Ayes 32, noes 6. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from King George, Senator Stewart.
I apologize, Mr. President, but having voted on the prevailing side by which we just passed that amendment, could we reconsider that?
For House Bill 1911?
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank the Senator. The question is, shall the vote by which the Senate adopted the governor's recommendations be reconsidered? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 37, noes 0.
Ayes 37, noes 0. The motion is agreed to. Senator from King George, Senator Stewart.
Could that just go by temporarily?
Without objection, House Bill 1911 will go by temporarily.
House Bill 1915, the House has agreed to the governor's amendments.
Senior Senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. President. House Bill 1915 ensures that a covered person is not required to exhaust a health carrier's full internal review if the diagnosis is cancer and he gets an adverse determination. He can also ask for an expedited review. That's what the bill does. The governor has added an emergency clause, and with that explanation, I ask that we concur with the governor's amendment.
Thank the Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 1915? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 1915 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, noes 0.
Ayes 38, noes 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 1942, the House has agreed to the governor's amendments.
Senator from Southern Fairfax, Senator Barker.
Mr. President, I move that we adopt the governor's amendments here. And
Senators, the floor.
Briefly to the bill. This is a bill that deals with establishing minimum standards for behavioral health services in local correctional facilities and sets discharge planning requirements for those people who have serious mental illness. The governor's amendment simply adds to the process for discharge of people with serious mental illness a provision for including families in that discharge process, discharge planning process, where appropriate. And as a reasonable type of thing, I think I'd hope it'd be the pleasure of the body to adopt this amendment.
Thank you, Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 1942? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 1942 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, noes 0.
Ayes 38, noes 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2042, the House has rejected the governor's amendment. House Bill 2053, the House has agreed to the governor's amendment.
Mr. President.
From Bedford, Senator Newman.
Mr. President, could that bill go by temporarily?
Without objection, House Bill 2053 will go by temporarily.
House Bill 2141, the House has agreed to the governor's amendments.
Senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley.
Thank you, Mr. President. I now move that we adopt the governor's recommendation for House Bill 2141. And speaking to that motion,
Thank you,
sir.
Senator. You have the floor.
Thank you, members of the Senate. House Bill 2141, if you remember, authorized local governing bodies to contract with broadband services providers who then would construct, maintain, and own communication facilities and equipment that would require the facilitation and delivery of last-mile broadband services to their underserved areas and our rural areas throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. The governor took a real close look at this bill, and he made an amendment, and let me relay that amendment to you. He changed MBPS to MBPS. You think that's insignificant, but it's significant because MBPS means basically how much of a file is downloadable or uploadable per second, but MBPS is how you specify internet connection speeds. So there. That's why we're here. That's why we do what we do. And so with that explanation, which made no sense, I now move that we agree to the governor's recommendation.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2141? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2141 be agreed to? All in favor, the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 37, no 0, ruled 36-1.
Ayes 37, no 0, rule 36-1. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2234, the House has agreed to the governor's amendments.
Who wants to field this one? Okay.
Mr. President.
Senator from Roanoke County, Senator Suderline.
Mr. President, I move that we adopt the governor's recommendation to House Bill 2234 and speaking to that motion.
The senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. House Bill 2234 is the companion bill to my Senate bill, which would provide parental leave to state employees in an expanded number of cases. The reason I carried that bill for several years was because I thought adoption should be included. This year, when it went over to the House, which is where it had been stuck the 3 previous years, they passed it. And in a different form when it went to conference. It was entirely the Senate provision, and in the way that we passed the bill originally here in the Senate, as I introduced it, with the sole exception being that the House took out parental leave benefits for state employees if they had a foster care placement. The governor's amendment puts the foster care placement back in as a provision for parental leave. So this is something that every member of the Senate, we've already voted for. I hope it will be the pleasure, and I'm glad that the House is, I wish they would have liked it the first time, but I'm glad that it's coming forward, and I hope it will be pleasure of the body to adopt the governor's recommendation and conform it to the version of the bill as originally passed this body.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2234?
Mr. President.
Senator from Loudoun County, Senator Black.
Could the gentleman respond to a question?
Senator, yield for a question.
Yes, and I would also point out this is identical to what we previously adopted earlier in the day.
Senator yield. You have the floor.
Yes. What I'm wondering is this. I know a number of people who are who do foster care work, and they care for children. It's a wonderful thing. It's a tremendous value to society. But I do know that often they may have several foster children. The children move from their natural parents into foster care, and after a couple of months they may move back to their original parents. There's a tremendous amount of mobility among foster care children. And unlike an adoption or a childbirth where you know that child is yours and you keep them, the foster child they tend to be much more transient, and it's not unusual that a foster child might be placed for 3 or 4 months and then be moved back to the natural parents or moved somewhere else. And my question would be, is there something in this that would somehow avoid kind of a chaotic situation where an employer might be required to give the parental leave, say, 6 or 8 times in a calendar year?
Mr. President,
Senator's floor.
I would tell the senator that this bill relates to employees of the Commonwealth. So this is not something about requiring parental leave for foster care placements in private employers. So there would be nothing in this bill to require private employers to do what you asked. There was in the question and some of the concern you expressed about the mobility of these children who often are in tough spots. That was a question that was raised in House appropriations. That was why the House was unwilling to adopt this provision. The House spent a lot of time looking at this to see when the governor amended it, to see if this is something that would be acceptable to them. And their investigations confirmed what I also believe, that the Commonwealth can do this without it being problematic. If that is not to be the case, I think there would be nothing to prevent us from adding additional safeguards. But this only deals with our own Commonwealth workforce. This is something I think where we, in our role as basically the board directors for this large employer, are deciding that this is the benefit we're going to give to our state employees. And I think that it's very critical that we provide it for adoption. This is a 4-year effort to make it happen. I think it also makes sense to provide it for foster care families. And I would again point out, this is an amendment that we previously adopted to my bill in the block this morning, and it also is identical to the language as passed this body and passed Senate General Laws when I presented it earlier this year.
I thank the gentleman. And, Mr. President, if I could comment briefly on the measure. Ladies and gentlemen, I intend to vote for this, but I would hope that there is an examination of how this works out over the next couple of years, because there are people who take in foster care. It's a means of supplementing family income in many cases, and even though it is somewhat restricted because it's limited to government employees, it still could create a very chaotic situation for government employers, and we do need to watch after it. You know, I think we want to do something that is good. We want to take care of children and take care of the families that take care of children, but I would just caution that we look after that in the future and make sure that there's not some further legislation that might not be required in the future. Thank you.
Thank the senator. For what purpose, Junior Senator from Richmond City, Senator McClellan, rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking briefly to the bill.
Senator, the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just assure the gentleman from Loudoun, if you look at line 20 of the bill, parental leave is limited to only once in a 12-month period, and the governor did not change that portion of the bill. So regardless of how many foster children you may have in a given year, you can only take parental leave once in a 12-month period. And so I think that will take care of the gentleman's concerns.
Question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2234 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, no 0.
Ayes 38, no 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2252, the House has agreed to the governor's amendment.
Senator from King George, Senator Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd move we adopt the governor's amendment.
Senators, the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you all recall, this bill allowed a landowner whose property traversed 2 different counties or firearms ordinances over 2 different counties to pick the largest portion of it to have the ordinance apply to his entire tract of land. And what the governor's amendments do is it puts this into a study to let DGIF look at it, and there's a reenactment clause for 2020, which I think is probably a good idea as we looked at this bill. So I would ask that you all support the governor's amendment.
Thank you, Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2252? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2252 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 29, noes 7.
Ayes 29, noes 7. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2263, the House has agreed to the governor's amendment.
Senator from Mecklenburg, Senator Ruff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the governor's amendments be accepted. Speaking
Senator,
of that, House Bill 2263 modifies the existing provisions of the Firefighters and EMT Procedural Guarantee Act by stating that if a breach in procedure occurs, any evidence obtained shall be excluded from any case against the individual. The governor's amendment clarifies that the case should be actually administrative hearing. I renew the motion to pass.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2263? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2263 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? All the senators voted. Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, noes 0.
Ayes 38, noes 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2296, the House has rejected the governor's amendments. House Bill 2303, the House has rejected the governor's amendments. House Bill 2306, the House has rejected the governor's amendments. House Bill 2328, the House has rejected the governor's amendment. House Bill 2339, there was no action as of right now. House Bill 2441, the House agreed to the governor's amendments.
Senator from Grayson, Senator Carrico.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the governor's recommendation.
Thank you, Senator. You have the floor.
As everyone remembers, this is House Bill 2441 that requires the Department of Motor Vehicles to issue a special identification card without photographs to people based on their sincerely held religious objections to having their picture taken. The governor's recommendation was done on the suggestion of the Department of Legislative Services that recommended a minor technical amendment to clarify that special identification cards like driver's license must be unexpired for it to be used as a proof of legal presence when someone applies for this new kind of special ID without a photo. I hope it would be the pleasure to support the recommendation and that my seatmate asked for no photo on his license.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2441? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2441 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, noes 0.
Ayes 38, noes 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2440.
Mr. President. Senator from Roanoke County, Senator Suderline, rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. Having voted on the prevailing side in which the Senate agreed to the governor's recommendations on House Bill 2252, I would ask that the Senate reconsider that vote.
Was that page 45?
Yes, sir.
Question is, shall the vote by which the governor's recommendations were agreed to regarding House Bill 2252 be reconsidered? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, noes 0.
Ayes 38, noes 0. The motion is agreed to. Senator from King George, Senator Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. President. Having previously explained the governor's amendments, I would move we adopt the governor's amendments, and also I should have let you know that the House patron was agreeable to these amendments as well.
Thank the senator. The question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2252 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 28, noes 10.
Ayes 28, noes 10. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2443. The House has rejected the governor's amendments. House Bill 2477. The House has agreed to the governor's amendments.
Senior Senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. President. House Bill 2477 allows APCO, Appalachian Power, to for those customers they have that want to purchase a different generating source, requires them to pay the non-fuel generation capacity costs along with the transmission costs. Also, typically there's a 5-year notification process to get back to use existing utility. This reduces it down to 3 years. The governor has amended the bill. There was some concern a little bit from some of the folks that already applied for aggregation petition from the State Corporation Commission, and also were entered a competitive power agreement in February of 2019. They wanted to make abundantly sure that these folks were not covered by this legislation. So with that explanation, I ask that we concur with the governor's amendments.
Thank you, Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2477? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2477 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, no 0.
Ayes 38, no 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2528, the House has rejected the governor's amendments. House Bill 2546, the House has agreed to the governor's amendments.
Senator from Bedford, Senator Newman.
Mr. President, I move that we concur with the governor's amendments and speaking to that motion.
Thank you, Senator. You have the floor.
Mr. President, the governor's amendments really do a couple of different things. One, it renames the review team and replaces the word death with mortality, which makes sense and does this in a number of locations. Mr. President, it also adds to the list that will be on the review team the Virginia Midwife Alliance. I hope that we would concur with the governor's amendments.
Thank the Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2546? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2546 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? All the senators voted. Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, no 0.
Ayes 38, no 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2615, the House has agreed to the governor's amendments.
Senator from Rockingham, Senator Obenshain.
Mr. President, I move that the governor's amendments be agreed to. Speaking to this,
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, what this bill did, you remember Senator Kerko, Senator from Grayson, had legislation during session that provided that murder of a law enforcement official carries a mandatory minimum sentence of life in prison. And the House had a companion bill, and it came out of their chamber as a much broader bill. And there was a discussion on the floor of the fact that there were some ongoing discussions as to whether the broader approach was preferable, which was an approach indicating that anybody convicted of capital murder, whether law enforcement officer or otherwise, would have a mandatory minimum of life in prison, or whether it was a better approach to adopt the Kerko mandatory minimum only for capital murder of a law enforcement official. The governor believes that Senator from Grayson had it right, and that the mandatory minimum should be applied to capital murder of a law enforcement officer, and so amended it so both of the bills are conformed to the narrower form. And with that, members recall the sound policy reasons for that and the moving emotional testimony before the Courts Committee and the Finance Committee by family members of murdered law enforcement officials. I think you will remember the strong policy considerations that mitigate in favor of adopting this approach, and with that, I move that we adopt the governor's amendments.
Thank the Senator. For what purpose, Senator from James City County, Senator Norment, rise?
Mr. President, will the gentleman from Rockingham yield for a question?
Senator yield for a question.
I yield.
Senator yields. You have the floor.
Mr. President, my question is, I am very confused and befuddled. I thought we just heard an eloquent argument an hour or so ago against minimum mandatory punishments.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I would point out that it was not I who argued against mandatory minimum sentences. And in an appropriate circumstance, I think we all agree that I would hope that we all agree that capital murder of a law enforcement official, police officer who's murdered at Greyhound Station, a police officer who's murdered while pulling somebody over at a traffic stop, if the perpetrator of that is going to be charged with capital murder, life in prison ought to be the mandatory minimum.
Mr. President.
Hold on 1 second.
Thank you, Mr. President. If the gentleman from Eastern Fairfax County would be so generous to yield for a question.
Will Senator yield for a question?
I'll yield.
Senator yields. You have the floor.
Mr. President, my question would be, in this bill that we're discussing now on capital punishment, is it your position and that of the administration that a minimum mandatory is appropriate in this case?
Senator's floor.
Mr. President, I would say to the gentleman that if he recalls, I was one of the no votes to the senator from Grayson's bill. So at least when his bill came through, I was consistent. But I like this amendment because it reduces the scope of the mandatory minimums to only one instead of all 7 of the subsections that it originally applied for, which is one of the reasons I voted against this bill when it came through last time as well. I cannot speak for the administration, though. You'd have to ask them. I believe the governor's already signed the senator from Grayson's bill because I didn't see a veto on it or an amendment, so I suspect the governor supports this policy, although I don't.
Thank the senator. For what purposes does Senator from Loudoun County, Senator Black, rise?
President, I guess I would ask a question of the gentleman from Grayson.
Will Senator yield for a question?
I'll yield.
Senator yields. You have the floor.
I strongly supported this bill and absolutely understand the importance of severely punishing people who are involved in capital murder of a police officer. I am less clear on why it is not also very important to harshly punish those who are convicted of capital murder of other individuals. And I don't mean in any way to diminish the importance of law enforcement. I understand their key role and their tremendous exposure, but I have a lot of sympathy for anybody who suffers capital murder.
Senator's floor.
Just to try to answer the gentleman the best way I know how, both the bill, Senate Bill 1501, that the gentleman from Fairfax is talking about that passed the General Assembly, was only drawn to law enforcement when it was introduced, and so was the House bill. Question was when the changes were made in committee to this bill, making it much broader than only police officers, would that be germane to the bill? And we did, and I don't believe it was, and this was just conformed to that bill that I had.
I'll say I thank the gentleman.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard regarding House Bill 2615? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations to House Bill 2615 be agreed to? All in favor, the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 34, noes 4.
Ayes 34, noes 4. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2664, the House has agreed to the governor's amendment.
Senior Senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. President. House Bill 2664 requires all employers to provide on each payday an employee pay stub or online information dealing with the name and address of the employer, the number of hours worked by that employee, his pay rate during that pay period. The governor has merely put a technical amendment on there, changing the word any to the to make it consistent with the rest of the sentence. And so with that explanation, I move that we accept the governor's amendment.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard regarding House Bill 2664? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2664 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 37, noes 0.
Ayes 37, noes 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
House Bill 2686, the House has rejected the governor's amendments. House Bill 2718, the House has agreed to the governor's amendments.
Mr. President.
Senior Senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Wagner.
This bill is identical to the bill that we talked about concerning the funding for Interstate 81 as well as the rest of the interstate highway system. I think we debated it at length. And so with that explanation, I move that we accept the governor's amendments.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard on House Bill 2718?
Mr. President.
Senator from Rockingham, Senator Obenshain.
Mr. President, with apologies to the body, I would ask that amendments 1, 4, 7, 10, 13, and 19 be taken out of the block and voted on separately, that being the truck registration fees, which I would again ask the body to adopt.
I think, do we get, it's
1, 4, 7, 10, 13, and 19.
Is that it? All right. So we're going to take two votes, first on that block of amendments or recommendations, and then on the remaining. So let's start with that block. Question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to amendments to House Bill 2718, specifically amendments 1, 4, 7, 10, 13, and 19, be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 25, noes 12.
Ayes 25, noes 12. Governor's recommendations are agreed to. Senior Senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Wagner.
And now, Mr. President, I will move that we adopt the rest of the amendments.
Thank you, Senator. Question is, shall the remaining recommendations from the governor to House Bill 2718 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 22, noes 14.
Ayes 22, noes 14. The remaining recommendations from the governor are adopted.
Page 58, House Bill 2762. The House has agreed to the governor's amendments.
Senator from Mecklenburg, Senator Ruff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move we adopt the governor's amendment. And speaking to that motion,
Thank you, Senator. You have the floor.
House Bill 2762 prohibits the use of Class B firefighting foam that contains PFA chemicals for training and testing purposes. The amendment is purely technical, requested by Legislative Services.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2762? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2762 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, noes 0.
Ayes 38, noes 0. The governor's recommendations are adopted.
House Bill 2766, the House has agreed to the governor's amendment.
Senator from Bedford, Senator Newman.
Mr. President, I move that we agree with the governor's amendment. Speaking that motion.
Thank you, Senator. You have the floor.
Mr. President, this is a bill that requires the Board of Health to promulgate regulation that indicates that every healthcare facility that plans to provide charity care report that amount back to the agency at least once every 3 years. Mr. President, this is a technical amendment that continues in all sides of the bill to ensure that nursing homes are exempt from the legislation. I hope that we would agree with the recommendation of the governor.
Thank you, Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2766? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2766 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 38, noes 0.
Ayes 38, no 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
Returning to page 41, House Bill 1911.
Senator from King George, Senator Stewart.
Again, could that go by temporarily, Mr. President, please?
Without objection, that bill will go by temporarily.
Page 43, House Bill 2053.
Senator from Bedford, Senator Newman.
Mr. President, I think that we may be taking a break soon, so I would hope that the bill will go by temporarily again.
Without objection, that bill will also go by temporarily.
That's all we have at this time. That's all we have at this time.
Senator from James City County, Senator Norment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would now ask that we stand in recess until 5:40. The House is preparing to communicate something to us. It's going to take a few minutes, and they're in recess. But immediately upon adjournment, if the members on this side would retire to the prayer room, that would be very nice.
Thanks, Senator. Senator from Fairfax City, Senator Peters.
Yeah, Mr. President, if the members of the Democratic Caucus could join me for a karaoke contest in the back room, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. Without objection, the Senate will stand in recess until 5:40 p.m. The Senate will come to order. The senators will please take their seats. Those persons not entitled to the privilege of the floor will please retire to the gallery.
Senator from James City.
Senator from James City County, Senator Norment.
Mr. President, it's my understanding. Thank you, sir. We have received a communication from the House, which I believe is House Bill 1700, and I respectfully move we waive the reading of any communication from the House of Delegates.
Thank the Senator. The question is, shall the reading of the communication from the House of Delegates be waived? All in favor of waiving the reading will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk, close the roll.
Ayes 35, noes 3.
Ayes 35, noes 3. The reading of the communication from the House of Delegates is waived. Senator from James City County, Senator Norment.
Thank you, Mr. President. According to my hieroglyphics, that we had two bills, House Bill 1911 on page 41. It was passed by temporarily. House Bill 2053, I believe, on 43. If we could perhaps take those up and then go to House Bill 1700 or the budget bill on the various budget amendments, sir.
Thank you, Senator.
I'm sorry.
Madam Clerk.
Page 41, House Bill 1911.
Let's field this. Senator from Grayson, Senator Carrico.
Thank you, Mr. President, and speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, as I was speaking earlier, want to try to make it clear what the recommendations was of the conference committee and what the recommendations are by the governor. The recommendations by the governor is to put the section of the code back into this bill that we took out in conference, because you're making this on a first offense a Class 1 misdemeanor. By rejecting the governor's amendments, you're rejecting the fact that we're going to put wreckers, trash trucks, funeral vehicles, community watch vehicles, all those vehicles of that section of the code that's listed on each of those vehicles that we add each year that has amber flashing lights. We're still leaving intact law enforcement, fire rescue, those vehicles that are out there that are protecting us when we're broke down in an accident and whatever. But you're creating a Class 1 misdemeanor on a first offense when you do this. And if you leave that amber section with the list of all those that are with wreckers in there, you're creating a Class 1 misdemeanor for all those vehicles also. So as a recommendation of the conference committee to take those out, leave the rescue and fire in there. This bill was brought by the delegate because of an incident happened to a fireman, and I think it's only appropriate that we address those on a Class 1 misdemeanor, leave passing the amber lights as a traffic infraction. And I hope we would reject the recommendation.
Thank the Senator. For what purpose does Senator from Prince William, Senator McPike, rise?
Mr. President, rise to speak in favor of the governor's amendment.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. To quickly recap a couple of things, this was actually approved by the patron in the House. Secondly, I've been on the fire service 20 years, and I can tell you numerous times where it's actually our VDOT safety patrol that actually gets to an accident first with amber lights. And for me, they deserve the same level of protection and respect of the road. And that's what this amendment is about. These folks risk their lives every day up and down I-81. We talked about all those wrecks earlier. The same thing is true on 95 all throughout our regions. And I think it's important that we show the same level of respect to these important state workers as we do to fire and police, Mr. President. And I ask that the governor's amendment pass.
Thank the Senator. For what purpose, Senator from King George, Senator Stewart, rise?
Speak to the amendments, Mr. President.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I rise to speak against the governor's amendments and associate myself with the comments from the gentleman from Grayson. Just so everybody understands, right now, the move over law in Virginia, if it's police, fire, or rescue on the side of 95 or wherever, and you go by and you don't move over, it's a Class 1 misdemeanor. And I think all of us support that, and we voted for that. And the way this bill left is if you included the amber lights, which are tow trucks, a DMV, and a few others, then it's a traffic infraction if you do it. And keep in mind, under the Class 1 misdemeanor, the reckless driving, you can lose your license for 1 or 2 years. So it's a severe penalty. What this bill, what the amendment does is now it takes those amber lights, the tow truck, the DMV truck, and if you pass by that without getting over, you're going to raise it to a Class 1 misdemeanor. 12 months in jail and a $2,500 fine. That's a stiff punishment from a traffic infraction, and you lose your license for up to 1 or 2 years. Now, I think it's appropriate for law enforcement, fire and rescue, but you know, I came up today and I passed 5 DMV vehicles on the shoulder. I don't know what they were doing, but if I didn't get over, I'm sorry, VDOT, thank you. That's a Class 1 misdemeanor. 12 months in jail and $2,500 fine, that's just a severe punishment and the loss of your license. I think it's one of those things where we are really over-punishing something, and we need to give that due consideration. And I think the governor's amendment just goes too far on this one. The bill was good as it left the Senate.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Alexandria? Senator Eben rise.
Briefly to speak to the amendment.
Senator, has the floor.
You know, as the senator from Prince William said, these vehicles can sometimes be the first on the scene. And it just brought to mind that we left here a few months ago, and I got a flat tire on 95, pulled over to the shoulder, called, and the vehicle that came was the people who, the roadside assistance folks. And I'm glad they were there, and I'm further glad that that they prevented anything from happening, and I think they are deserving of the same support. Further, in response to the senator from King George, I would just say that that we know that judges and prosecutors have discretion, and I trust them to use it.
Thank the senator. Senator from Grayson, Senator Carrico, would you mind making the formal motion just to make sure we have a live motion on the floor for these recommendations from the governor?
I'm sorry?
Would you just mind moving the motion that the recommendations be agreed to so we have something to vote on? I don't know if
I move the recommendation by the governor
be agreed
to with the recommendation to reject the amendment.
Thank the senator. With the recommendation that they be rejected, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 11, noes 27.
Ayes 11, noes 27. The motion fails.
On page 43, House Bill 2053.
Senator from Southern Fairfax, Senator Barker.
Mr. President, I move that we agree with the amendment, adopt amendment that the governor has proposed on this. This is dealing with school counselors. What the amendment does is a couple of things. One is it establishes, and it differs a little bit from legislation that we had passed that came from a Senate bill. It was the senator from Petersburg that had legislation related to school counselors. What this does is establish a ratio of school counselors to students that must be met separately for elementary school students, middle school students, and high school students. And it does it in 2 categories. One is for the fiscal year that will start in July of this year, the 2019-2020 fiscal year, and the second category is for the following year, starting in the following year, effective in July of 2020. What it does is it provides a level of funding, provides for ratios of students per counselor. It reduces it from what's now in the standards of quality in all three categories for the fiscal year that we will be entering into in July of 2019. That is consistent with what's in the funding that's in the budget. It then goes on to provide for a further reduction in the number of students per counselor in all three categories of schools, and it's actually a slightly larger decrease in the 2020-2021 budget than in the 2019-2020 budget. The funding is in the budget for the 2019-2020. Obviously, we don't have funding for the 2021 budget because that will be the next biennium that we will that we're dealing with that there. So they'll have to be addressed at some point. What we have is also a situation where the amendment also removes an enactment clause that would have basically said that the language in this proposed bill, in the House Bill 2053, would in effect override any other act of the Assembly this year, including the budget. So that is basically where we are on it, and I think the senator from Bedford wants to address this issue as well. So.
Thank the senator. For what purpose, Senator from Bedford, Senator Newman, rise?
Mr. President, speaking to the motion.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I agree with almost everything the senator from Southern Fairfax mentioned, except for his conclusion. Mr. President, what we generally, what we don't do is we don't go into the standards of quality and speak aspirationally. We just don't do that. And that is the net effect of what happens here. In other words, we had an opportunity, and your public education subcommittee, which I think was well represented, we fought for every dime. We came forward with about $15 extra million for counselors. We're going to do more next year if we possibly can. We think counselors are working well. But what we don't do is we don't go into the Code of Virginia and speak aspirationally about what we would like to do and have that be what is required to be done under the standard of quality. So this is well-intentioned, but what it ultimately ends up doing is it ends up directing by the Code of Virginia trying to override the budget, and you're going to find in the budget, when we get to the budget items, they're trying to remove notwithstanding the budget, which that just turns everything on its head. I know we all want to have more counselors, but I think what we cannot do is, in my opinion, support this because it means that we will be telling localities, telling others that you basically will have $36 million of funding when we only approve 15. So I would respectfully hope that we would reject this one and continue in our subcommittee to work for more counselors.
Thank the senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to House Bill 2053? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendations with regard to House Bill 2053 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk, close the roll.
Ayes 16, noes 22.
Ayes 16, noes 22. The motion fails.
Page 25, House Bill 1700.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Oh, excuse me.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Mr. President,
you're about right.
Mr. President, I was speaking to the lady in charge.
You're smart. You're a smart man. Where's the floor?
Because I expected that we need a reporting of a block of amendments that came over from the House, and it would be my feeling that if we can get that block reported, then there are just a handful that we'll want to pull out of that block. Subject to one exception, and I certainly have a list to pull out. So I would ask the clerk if we could to report what has come over.
Okay, I think Madam Clerk.
Okay, these are the amendments that are before us at this time. Amendments 1 through 6. Amendments 10 through 14. I'm giving people time to flip their pages. Amendments 16 through 33. Amendment 37, and Amendment 40.
Okay. Mr. President.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
I would ask that amendment number 4 on page 26 be removed from the block. Amendment number 11 on page 29. Amendment number 23 on page 34. Amendment number 31 on page 37. Amendment number 32 on page 37. And amendment number 33 on page 38.
Without objection, those amendments will be removed from the block.
And Mr. President, with that, unless there are other member requests, I would move that the block pass.
Thank the Senator. Question is,
Mr. President.
Senator from Roanoke County, Senator Suderline.
I had a little trouble following that. Can the clerk report what will now be in the block after what's been removed?
Okay. Amendments 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. Amendments 10, 12, 13, 14. Amendments 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. Oops, sorry, 31's out. 37 and 40. 31, 32, and 33 are out.
With that, Mr. President, I would then request Amendment 25 be removed from the block.
Without objection, Amendment 25 is removed from the block. Okay. Question is, shall the governor's recommendation with regard to House Bill 1700 be agreed to in a block with the exception of amendments 4, 11, 23, 25, 31, 32, and 33? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Okay. Can we clear the vote? We strike the vote without objection. Senator from Hanover, Senator McDougal.
Mr. President, we missed one, number 21. That could come out of the block.
Okay. I don't think I missed that one, actually.
Is that out of the block?
No. You didn't take it out, but you can now.
We are going to.
All right, we'll do that now. All right. Is there any other amendments that senators want to take out of the block?
Mr. President.
Senator from Chesterfield, Senator Chase.
On page 3, could I ask Amendment 5 to come out of the block, please?
Without objection.
Number 5.
Without objection, Amendment 5 will be removed from the block. Any other amendments to be removed from the block before we vote? We're all good? All right. Question is, shall the governor's recommendation with regard to House Bill 1700 be agreed to? That is all amendments with the exception of amendments 4, 5, 11, 21, 23, 25, 31, 32, and 33. All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk, close the roll.
Ayes 38, no 0.
Ayes 38, no 0. The governor's recommendations are agreed to.
Amendment number 4.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Senate, I move that item number 4 pass, but I would ask the members to reject that motion, and I'd like to speak to that.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. This was an issue that was before us during our budget deliberations, and it was a consensus that we would not spend this additional $1.5 million in general fund to support educational outreach and preparation for the 2020 census. So I would ask the members to reject the amendment.
Thank the Senator. For what purpose is Junior Senator from Richmond City, Senator McClellan, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the amendment.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I'd ask that we vote in favor of this amendment. In addition to being important to count all of our citizens for accurate representation for redistricting purposes, the census counts impact the amount of federal funding that Virginia receives. And just to put that into context a little bit, for every resident who is not counted in the census, Virginia could lose $2,000 in federal funding. In 2015, $675 billion was allocated based on census data, and Virginia has received $18 billion in federal funding based on census data. It is estimated that 1.6 million Virginians are hard to count and need additional outreach in order to get them counted for census purposes. Again, to put that in context, to let you know where some of the individuals are who are hard to count, 23.1% are in Newport News, 22.2% are in Hampton, 24.4% in Norfolk, 21% in Portsmouth, 21% in Virginia Beach, 18.5% each in Chesapeake and Suffolk, 25.9% in New Kent County, 31% in Lee County, 23.3% in the city of Richmond, 27.3% in Radford, 31.5% in Rappahannock, 27.4% in Washington County, 35.31% in Stafford. So if these individuals are undercounted, and that is the purpose of the census outreach, is to make sure that hard to count individuals get counted. If they're not, these localities are, and that's just a few of them, are likely to receive less federal funding based on census data because those individuals will be undercounted. So I just wanted to reiterate that there's much more at stake here than making sure that we count everyone for redistricting purposes. There is a financial hit in federal funding if we do not have an accurate count. And this funding in the budget is used to help ensure that hard-to-count individuals will, in fact, be counted. And for that reason, I ask that you vote in favor of this amendment.
What purpose is Senator from James City County? Senator Norment, rise.
Mr. President, I rise to encourage the body to reject the governor's amendment to amendment number 4.
Senator has the floor.
I appreciate what the gentlelady said, but I am also mindful that there was a fairly significant conversation during the regular session about addressing this issue, and the collective wisdom of the body was to not go in that direction. Secondly, while I appreciate the numbers that were read off, I would say that that does represent conjecture, and I have been less than enamored with some of the social media that I have read as to the focus of this, so I would ask you to please reject it.
Do any other senators wish to be heard with regard to amendment number 4? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendation be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk, close the roll.
Ayes 18, noes 20.
Ayes 18, noes 20. Governor's recommendation is rejected.
Amendment number 5.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Senate, I move that amendment number 5 pass and speak to that.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Senate. This deals with CCAM, which I think most would acknowledge that have looked at this, that it is not exceeding expectations, but essentially underperforming. And we'd put $1.7 million in here to cover some of the expected needs of the entity This amendment actually removes it, but we transfer it over to item 10. So if the members would look at item 10, you'll see that that money is picked up there under the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. So there's no loss to CCAM, but rather just a transfer of where that money comes from, and with the oversight being under the grant programs of the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. So I would again move that the amendment pass.
Thank the Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard regarding amendment number 5? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendation be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senator desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 36, noes 2.
Ayes 36, noes 2. The governor's recommendation is agreed to.
Amendment number 11.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that amendment number 11 pass, but I would ask the members to reject that motion. Speaking of that briefly.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. This coincides with the House Bill 2053 just passed, which the Senator from Bedford eloquently explained, in that there is some uncertainty in there, and there's a simple notwithstanding clause in here relative to that bill that the budget would override. Since that bill has just been before us, not been signed, they think it would be appropriate for that notwithstanding language to remain in the budget. It does no harm if not needed, and I would defer to the Senator from Bedford if further explanation is needed.
No? He did well. Okay, great. Any other senators wish to be heard regarding amendment number 11? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendation be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 16, noes 22.
Ayes 16, noes 22. The governor's recommendation is rejected.
Amendment number 21.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Senate, I think this is an item that the House did agree to, which perhaps there are mixed feelings about, and this I would move that item 21 pass, but I would ask the members to reject that motion. Speak to that.
Senator has the floor.
This, Mr. President, members of the Senate, this language would allow the governor to authority for merit increases for agency heads, cabinet members, something we've not done in the past, and we think, or at least I think, and I will ask if other members concur, would probably not be appropriate to start right now. So I would ask the members to reject the amendment.
Thank the Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard regarding amendment number 21? What purpose is Senator from Southern Fairfax? Senator Barker rise.
Just briefly to address this particular issue here.
Senator has the floor.
The amendment that's proposed here would make this authority that the governor would have to deal with merit salary increases for agency heads and cabinet officials consistent with existing, would be similar to language that we already have for independent and legislative agencies. So it would just provide more equity in terms of the leadership of various agencies.
One person from James City County, Senator Norment, rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to ask the body to reject the amendment number 21.
With the recommendation that it be rejected, the question is, shall the governor's recommendation be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 18, noes 20.
Ayes 18, noes 20. Governor's recommendation is rejected.
Amendment number 23.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Mr. President, I would ask that that one go by temporarily.
That objection, Amendment 23, will go by temporarily.
Amendment number 25.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Mr. President, I move that Amendment 25 be agreed to, and I'd like to speak to that.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. Amendment number 25 provides authority for non-general funds to be expended for detailed planning for a capital project at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, as we reviewed this, this was in front of us as we deliberated the budget in conference. At that point in time, we decided not to do it because we were concerned about these planned projects that were stacking up, that we were not ready to move forward, and sometimes the planning goes stale when we're not ready to move a large bond projects. At this point in time, there seems to be a consensus that we will allow this project to go forward, so I would recommend that we approve the amendment.
Thank the Senator. Do any other senators wish to be heard regarding amendment number 25? Seeing none, the question is, shall the governor's recommendation be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 36, noes 2.
Ayes 36, noes 2. The governor's recommendation is agreed to.
Amendment 31.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that amendment number 31 pass, but with the recommendation that it be rejected. Let's speak to that.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. This particular amendment deals with the revenue that would be generated by the fact that we have deconformed on the Pease Amendment, which at the federal level restricts the amount of contribution or tax-deductible contributions that the wealthier constituents that are out there have. The net impact of this would be, if we reject this, there is a possibility that some additional funds will be transferred to the taxpayer relief fund that we hadn't anticipated, perhaps a fairly significant amount, up to $100 million. It would be my contention that if this happens, we can address that in the future, and at this point, we would rather that money go in the taxpayer relief fund rather than directly into the revenue reserve. So I would ask the members to reject the proposed amendment.
What purpose, Senator from James City County, Senator Norment?
Mr. President, with the, I'm sorry.
What purpose, Senator from Southern Fairfax, Senator
Mr.
Barker?
President, would the Senator from Augusta yield for a question here?
Senator yield?
Yes, I'd be pleased to yield.
Senator yield,
yeah.
you have the floor.
My understanding is that the revenues from this have already been built into the budget that we have adopted. I'm just checking to make sure whether that is accurate, and if so, then does that present some issue in terms of the bottom line of the budget?
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I would suggest to the senator from Southern Fairfax that no, it would not impact our bottom line. The issue really, and this was an issue between the House and the Senate, really is where that money would go, into the revenue reserve or into the taxpayer relief fund. And it was the position, the majority position of the Senate initially, that it would go into the taxpayer relief fund. Having said that, if in fact when we come, those that are back here in January with a new budget and the governor when he prepares a budget, if there is some need to pull that money into the revenue reserve, obviously the budget can be changed at that time, but it will not impact the bottom line.
Follow-up question, if I might.
Senator, for further question?
Yes. So the question then would be, if it is going to go to the taxpayer relief fund, which I understand is what's intended here, how do we, in effect, transfer it from the revenue reserve fund if we've already put it into the revenue reserve fund in the budget?
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I would say to the gentleman, we already have appropriated, I think the figure is in the range of $117 million. I may have that number incorrect, but there are additional revenues that are anticipated that may happen as a result of this change that we haven't booked yet. Right. That's what we're talking about here. Additional revenues that, in talking with the Secretary of Finance, he feels like we're going to receive perhaps another, maybe up to $100 million or more additional dollars that he wanted to, or the administration is proposing would flow into the revenue reserve at a future time, rather than being allocated to the taxpayer relief fund. If we reject this, it will go into the taxpayer relief fund, but the money has not been received yet, has not been accounted for.
All right. I thank the senator. So.
Chairman.
Senator, what purpose, Senator from Bedford?
Mr. President, I may be able to help just a little bit here. As most of you remember, the bill that the senator from James City County passed related to tax relief, it had a very simple enactment clause, which is number 5. Number 5 looked at the entire bill, and in the first page of the bill, we add the peace section to that bill. On Section 5, in the last part of the bill, we end up in that section indicating exactly what will happen to the money and where it will fall. The money was very clearly indicated that money that was in this section of the code, up to $450 million, would fall to, revenues over that, would fall to the stabilization fund, the taxpayer relief fund. When we got into conference, the House had a perception on this that they indicated that they really wanted to make sure that that money was used for their reserve fund. They said that they interpreted the language here that it could go into reserve fund. We told them it would not. In other words, that was our position in conference. It would not. They felt that without making any other alterations, they'd be fine. Now we end up with a bill, an item for the governor. It comes up and says, I believe that the Senate was right, that will actually go to the taxpayer relief fund, and that is where it's going to go. The decision next year for all of us is going to be, what do we do with that money, right? So the money is still going to be there because we're still set on all the taxpayer relief items and how much they all cost. There is probably going to be a little more money in there because the revenues are looking a little better, but the money originally in the bill and in our budget was supposed to go to the taxpayer relief fund. So.
What purpose, Senator from James City County, Senator Norment, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise and associate myself with the comments that were just made from the senator from Bedford, but I would also share with you that a considerable amount of effort went in trying to construct an approach with taxation reform during this last session. And I would suggest to you that there was a fair amount of dialogue about this peace amendment, and the senator from Bedford summarized it very nicely. And I am just reticent to disturb that approach that we took during the regular session. And in fact, we will be looking at a biennium or a 2-year budget next year where we can make any appropriate adjustments. So consequently, I would ask you to please reject amendment number 31.
Do any other senators wish to be heard regarding amendment number 31? Seeing none, and with the recommendation that it be rejected, the question is, shall the governor's recommendation be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 18, noes 20.
Ayes 18, noes 20. Governor's recommendation is rejected.
Amendment number 32.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Mr. President, I move that amendment number 32 pass, but I would recommend that we reject that motion. I'd like to speak to that.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. As we all recall, the initial proposal from the governor would have returned funds on the earned income tax credit. We've set up a mechanism with our tax reform package where monies would be returned for people who file their tax returns by July 1st of this year in the amount of $110 per individual if they had that much tax liability, up to $220 for a married couple if they had that much tax liability. This change proposed by the governor would say that if you end up with no tax liability as a result of credits, then you could still receive the refund, which will possibly be done in October. I would ask that you reject that. It actually is counter to what we were proposing, that you had to have a tax liability no matter how you achieved that or unachieved that tax liability. If you wiped it out with credits, it would be the same thing, that you hadn't paid in, so you wouldn't receive it back. This also, as is indicated in our numbers, would reduce the taxpayer relief fund by $19.3 million. So I again would ask that this amendment be rejected.
Thank the senator. For what purpose is the senator from Southern Fairfax, Senator Barker, rise?
Would the senator from Augusta yield for a particular
Senator, yield
question?
for a question.
I'd be pleased to yield.
Yield. You have the floor.
You know, as I understand, this particular proposal, amendment that's before us here. What it would do was it would say that if someone had a tax liability after calculating their income and their deductions and all of those types of things, that they would be eligible for the refund based upon that tax liability, unless they then had, in effect, the tax credits that would, in effect, wipe that out.
That is correct. That is correct, Mr. President. I would say the gentleman.
Yes, and as I understand it, I think a portion of this would go to potential, if this amendment were to pass, would go to those who received earned income tax credit, but others of it would go to people who have contributed to the Neighborhood Assistance Fund, to land conservation types of things. The one big question I have is, generally, if you have a tax credit and you don't have enough liability to be able to take all of it, you can carry it over to the next year. In this case, there may be some people who, having filed their tax returns, would take a tax credit, but then would not be able to carry over remaining portions of that to the next year, but would not be able to recoup the amount that would be equivalent to what they would have gotten for the refund if they had not claimed that tax credit for that year. Is that correct?
Mr. President, if I understood the question, I would say that is correct, in that the tax credits could be carried over, but you would not be eligible if you had a $100,000 tax liability and had $100,000 of tax credits, so that you actually paid zero. You would not get your $110 back.
Just briefly addressing the bill, I do have some concern about those people who, in effect, are taking a tax credit, but then not able to carry over an equivalent amount from the potential refund that they otherwise would have received. So,
okay.
Thank you. Senator, for what purpose does Senator from James City County, Senator Norment, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise and ask the body to reject the amendment number 32. A couple of points. If you recall, the underlying philosophy that we had on the tax reformation initiative was that he who pays taxes should certainly be entitled to a refund if, in fact, you did not pay the tax and you did not get a refund. And we spent a lot of time trying to balance that between lower income and upper income individuals. I think a couple of very succinct statements that have been objectively made as it relates to amendment number 32 are governor's action. The governor's amendment would exclude tax credits from the calculation, allowing some taxpayers with no tax liability to receive a refund. That is totally contrary to the underlying premise that we have. Another comment, the governor's amendment would allow some taxpayers who paid no income tax for the year in 2018 to receive a refund if their tax liability was zero because they claimed a tax credit, such as the the earned income tax credit, which some of us categorically rejected from the very beginning. In addition, as the senator previously mentioned, it has a $19.3 million projected impact to the Taxpayers Relief Fund, and I would respectfully ask that you reject amendment number 32.
What purpose, Senator from Prince William County, Senator McPike, rise?
Mr. President, rise to speak in favor of the amendment.
Senator's the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. It seems to be pretty simple. The distribution actually, because of the tax credit provisions, can actually help those who have more income and, in fact, those who have less income. In fact, it's projected that this will help 150,000 Virginians, returning roughly $17.7 million back to the taxpayer. I think this body should accept the amendment. Thank you.
Senator, for what purpose, Senator from Bedford, Senator Newman, rise?
Mr. President, just speaking briefly.
Senator's the floor.
Mr. President, if that was all there was to it, it might be a different calculus that comes into this. But just think about this. If you ended up with $15 million of historical tax credits and your tax liability is $15 million, you get our $100. And so it doesn't matter how far on the top end. We had a lot of discussions about the top end, including the peace amendment and otherwise. It really doesn't matter how far on the top end you go. As long as you've got the credits, you actually get to participate in it. Mr. President, I really hope that this would be, with the $110 and the $220, something that we paid back to people that actually paid taxes, and I think that the governor's amendment, while well-intentioned, gets us away from that.
One purpose senator from Northern Fairfax, Senator Howell Rise.
To speak in favor of this amendment.
Senator has the floor.
I'm kind of amused when I'm hearing that somehow this body was against the earned income tax credit. That's actually not true. Half of us were very much in favor of it. And I also find somewhat objectionable the discussion that some people aren't paying taxes and so they should not get this minimal amount of a refund that we're giving taxpayers. Everyone in this Commonwealth is paying taxes. They are paying taxes on their food. They are paying taxes on their clothing. They are paying taxes on their school supplies. They are paying taxes on everything they buy. So I think we could do this minimal thing to help these taxpayers.
Senator, for what purpose, Senator from James City County, Senator Norment rise?
I don't know if I rise for an apology or not. I didn't mean to imply that this body was against an earned income tax credit. This senator was adamantly against making refunds to those who had the lower income earned tax credit. So if I misspoke on that, I certainly extend an apology. I was speaking for myself on this, and I look forward to legislation being introduced next year, repealing the sales tax, repealing all sorts of taxes so we can give some relief, and we will see how that plays out.
Question is, shall the governor's recommendation with regard to Amendment 32 be agreed to with the recommendation that it be rejected? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 18, noes 20.
Ayes 18, noes 20. Governor's recommendation is rejected.
Amendment 33.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. Item 30, I would move that item 33 pass, but I would ask the body to reject that. I'd like to speak to that briefly.
Senator has the floor.
I know perhaps there will be some difference of opinion on this, but it was a good intention that we didn't appropriately take into account the financial implications for during the session. I think if we reflect back, there was a bill that came out of the Senate, I believe, that would have basically provided this action. What we have discovered with the governor's proposed amendment, that there is unintended consequence in that if we actually eliminate the entire $100 portion of the fee that currently goes to trauma centers, we're going to leave no source of funding for that $11 million allocation for hospital trauma centers. And that is a significant impediment to whether or not we should pass this at this time. So I would ask the body to get this conversation started that we reject this amendment.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley Rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speak in favor of the budget amendment number 33.
The Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, this is exactly the bill that we passed 36-4 and sent to the House. Where in the House, in a subcommittee of 7 people, it was defeated and never saw the light of day. What you saw, and maybe you are aware over in the House, is that this budget amendment came over passing 70-29. A bipartisan effort on the House's side to finally vote on the floor on the merits of a piece of legislation that this body overwhelmingly passed. Dick, you got a phone call. And I love hearing highway to the danger zone when I'm speaking. But ladies and gentlemen, 4 people voted against this bill, and I'm sitting between 2 of them. There's not a lot of real estate of people voting no for this thing. more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, when it went down in the House and we didn't get that full vote, I went to the governor and asked him to put it in. Or maybe I didn't. I can't remember. But I did that because it's the right thing to do. It's the absolute right thing to do. Over 600,000 Virginians have their licenses suspended for non-payment of fines and court costs. That's it. Not for bad driving behavior. This doesn't correct bad driving behavior suspensions. But it gives those people an opportunity to rejoin society and the community. They don't have to drive in fear anymore because they're trying to keep their job. Or that they can go get that job now because they're getting their license back. I'm reminded that there's a young man, a wonderful father named Marcel Quinn, who's sitting right up there in the corner. Marcel Quinn has a young 3-year-old son. He lost his license only because he could not, due to his economic circumstances, pay his court costs and fines. And so every day, to take his child, his 3-year-old, to school, a round trip, 4 buses, 4 trains, 4 hours. That is a sacrifice that any father would make, but he shouldn't have to make that kind of sacrifice of time with he and his son on a bus for 4 hours, trains for 4 hours, 2 hours in, 2 hours back. We can take this step right now and make right what Virginia has done wrong and stop the debtor's prison, because some people economically cannot afford to pay the tax. So I'm asking you to support this budget amendment, substitute motion with the recommendation that it carry, that we pass this bipartisan in the same way we passed it here on this floor, 36 to these 2 guys. Okay? Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's not time to vote yet. Now, ladies and gentlemen, also remember, this is the second year of the budget, so we're going to have to come back. So its effectiveness is only from July to July. And we'll make that a permanent solution for all people who suffer from these economic circumstances. But also, too, I will tell you that the governor and his staff have assured me that we will fix the problem of a Scrivener's error that has occurred now. But right now, ladies and gentlemen, it is worth more to the Commonwealth and its productivity and its economy to put these people back on the road, working, being thriving members of the community and of their society, to help them with upward mobility and to break the cycle of poverty, than it is to stop it because of a Scrivener's error. And so, Mr. President, I renew my motion, my substitute motion. And I say we vote for this today. Let's vote for those Virginians who can't vote here because of this. Thank you.
Thank the Senator. For what purpose, the Senator from Southern Fairfax, Senator Barker, rise?
Mr. President, I stand with my brother from Franklin. Let's do the right thing.
Thank the Senator. For what purpose, the Senator from Loudoun, Senator Black, rise?
I rise to speak in favor of the measure.
Senator has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is only fair that on the final day that I vote for my brother over here from Franklin County. But seriously, I have been deeply concerned. When it comes to violent crime, hang them high. But I look at the minor offenders, the people who do small things, and I watch them. And there was a time when we were short on highway money, and so we went through and we put a fee on everything. I mean, anything that moved or didn't move, we put a fee on it, and it's the political way. If somebody doesn't have a lot of political clout, you put a fee on them because they can't get back at you. And poor people don't have a lot of political clout. And so we put so many fees, so many court fees on these poor people that, you take the typical person that you see in the general court, and they're in there, and, they're clinging to life. That's not my cell phone going off, is it? But anyway, these people are hanging on by their fingernails. And then all of a sudden they walk out, they come up, they do some trivial thing. In the old days, they'd have had a $50 fine. Yeah, they'd have gritted their teeth and they'd gone out and they'd have figured out a way to do it. Now, they get $1,000 for doing the same darn thing, and they can't possibly do it. And so what do? Well, the next thing that happens is they lose their job. They can't drive, or else maybe they drive without a license, and the whole thing doesn't work. The next thing, they're not paying the mortgage. The family, which is hanging on by its fingernails, falls apart. And we got this happening, and it's a very big deal. Now, I worry because we do use fines to enforce the traffic laws. And so, honestly, I don't know how this is going to work out, because you got to have some way of enforcing your law. But at the same time, if we've got, 600,000 or 700,000 people without licenses, that's a problem, and they got to get to work and all of this. So I think this is a great risk, and I hold my brother from Franklin accountable for the results and the outcome of this thing. But at the same time, I think we need to, wipe this slate clean, and we may come back after a couple years and say, okay, this doesn't quite work, and let's modify, because we got to have a way of enforcing legitimate fines. So I don't know what we're going to do in the future, but let's go ahead and do this now. Get these guys licenses, get them back on the road, get them back to work. I think it's the thing to do.
Thank the senator. For what purpose does the senator from Alexandria, Senator Eben, rise?
For 16 years since the day I've got to the General Assembly, I've been hoping to say that I associate my remarks with the gentleman from Loudoun, and today is that day. Further, it is the day that I speak against big government and its outrageous fees. And just to build further on what the gentleman from Franklin said and the gentleman from Loudoun, we're talking about Virginians who rely on access to driving to get access to education, child care, health care, and employment, and taking away that those availability of that is cruel and illogical. So I hope that we will support the amendment.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose does the senator from Roanoke County, Senator Suderline, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll just speak briefly to the amendment.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I hope it will be the pleasure of the Senate to adopt the amendment. I think the senators from Franklin, Loudoun, and Alexandria have all done a great job, so I won't speak too much to it, except just to point out that this is another great example of where the General Assembly for years went way too aggressive, and this is simply us correcting that over-aggression. And I appreciate all the leadership of the senator from Franklin on the issue.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose does the senator from Hanover, Senator McDougal, rise?
Mr. President, rise to speak to the motion.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, there's been a lot of eloquence, but I want to tell you about some of the things that are not being discussed in this measure. Certainly, Mr. President, the bill that the gentleman from Franklin proposed and passed through this body accomplished the goals that he said. But what this language does is not what that bill did. Mr. President, this bill, regardless of the reason you were suspended, so if you were convicted and your license by statute was taken for DUI, if you killed somebody while driving under the influence and you were convicted of vehicular manslaughter, if you had a hit and run and hit another person, if you were passing an emergency vehicle and didn't move over and the judge suspended your license, you're now not going to pay the fee to the trauma center. Yes, Mr. President, to the trauma center, the place where if you are hurt by somebody who was driving while they were drunk, you were hurt by somebody who hit you and didn't help you on the side of the road, or unfortunately, one of those individuals that perished because somebody did not move over, you're now not going to pay money to the trauma fund, the very individuals at the hospital that will be fighting to save your life. Mr. President, you might think that that's no money, but it's $11 million. And Mr. President, if this amendment passes in this form, which is no way for us to change it, we have to wait till next session in order to fix that. So I don't want anybody to go away with illusions. The topic that we are talking about to address is serious. And the senator from Franklin has done a tremendous job, even though we might not always have agreed over the last 2 years. But this amendment does a lot more than the bill that originally passed this body. So vote with your eyes open and know that there has to be some way to help those doctors that are working to fix holes that God put in you that were not intended. You want them to be funded. You want them to be at the highest state of readiness.
What purpose is the senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley, rise?
There's no one else, Mr. President.
Actually, Senator Hanger also wants to be heard. Do you want to wait?
Sure, well, he started it, so I'll just end here. It's really tough sitting next to this guy. It's just tough. Ladies and gentlemen, the senator from Loudoun, who I will miss dearly, and this was like Christmas. I just got to open up a gift that I did not expect with his support of this budget amendment. But, ladies and gentlemen, I do traffic work, and if you look on the back of that traffic ticket, you may have, and I have all the time, indigent counsel in one county that I serve in Franklin, and it may be a $25 fine. But if you add up all the costs that we put on the backside of that, it's $90 on top of the $25. And that is the difference maker, because those are not, those we call costs, but they're really taxes that are for, it's for the 911 center. It goes on this list. The courthouse fund, exactly. You know, we're talking about taxes, and we're taking away a right. It's a privilege to drive based on the qualifications, but the Supreme Court has said it is a right once you get it, and you cannot be deprived of that right from the government without due process, and that's what happens, a constitutional violation from the DMV. Let us also not forget that 2 years ago, Delegate Lupasi and myself passed a bill for the collections of fines by payment plans, but it did not affect nor help the people that had already, this over 600,000 that had already lost their license. It only helped those that were in future. And second, let us not forget that these act as civil judgments as well. And it is up to the Commonwealth's attorney usually to collect them or to send them to collection. It is also incumbent upon the government itself to find a way to make that collection happen when it doesn't happen. We also have the contempt power of the court. So when we say, well, nobody is ever going to pay their fine, that's just wrong. That's just wrong. We have tools in the toolbox that will help us. So I do not see a collapse of the fine paying in Virginia when we pass this budget amendment. Now let's pass this thing. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Grayson, Senator Carrico, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking against the bill.
The senator has the floor.
Mr. President, members of the body, I tried to teach my kids over the years the best way to stay out of trouble or to get out of trouble is not to ever get into trouble. And sometimes individuals have made mistakes, and I realize that. But when they don't own up to those mistakes or pay for them, there has to be a process in which the Commonwealth can take away something in order for them to pay these fines. I said it on the floor when we debated this the last time. You know, I spent 15 years and 3 months as a trooper, and a lot of the individuals that I stopped for driving revoked, I had an opportunity to notify them of their revocation because they didn't have proper notification. So I went ahead and notified them, never charged them. But the ones that I did charge, they weren't exactly going to work. They were going to one thing or another. And I feel like at a cost of about $11 million, the government is bailing out a lot of individuals that have made mistakes in their life and can't own up to it and pay for those mistakes. And I'm afraid that if we go down this road, that we're going to encourage people not to pay for those mistakes. And I think that my seatmate on the other side of the one sitting here is right. I think we really have a lot to think about when we go down this road of not holding those responsible for the mistakes they've made and for not paying the fines. And I believe that it's not going to result in anything other than more and more people being encouraged not to pay their fines if they're charged. I hope we'll defeat the amendment.
For what purpose does the senior senator from Fairfax, Senator Saslaw, rise?
Mr. President, members of the Senate, when that person can't pay that $500 or $1,000 fine and you take the license, don't kid yourself. It's costing society a lot more than that $500 to $1,000. If he happens to lose his job as a result of that, guess what? Now we're picking up public assistance, one form or another, Medicaid. We pay for that. He shows up in the emergency room. Next year, that's in our insurance bill. And if it gets to the point where he needs supplemental nutrition type stamps, we pay for that. It's not just that $250 or $500 or $1,000. We wind up picking up a lot more in social costs that are real dollars than just that fine. Why we would want to put, and let me tell you, of those 600,000 people, you can bet we're having to pick up the social cost, and they are considerable if any of those 600,000 have lost their jobs. It's not just the fine. If you yank that license, you're going to be shelling out a lot more than that fine before that person's life gets straightened out. So the senator from Franklin is entirely right. This is what we need to do. It is silly to put these people in a risk situation where they lose their employment, and then we have to wind up as a society paying an awful lot more. So I would hope that we would accept the amendment.
What purpose, Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger, rise?
Speak to the amendment briefly.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you. Mr. President, I started this conversation by saying just I was starting the conversation, and I realize now that I'm not going to prevail in my position, but I would like for it to be noted that in the last floor speech for the senator from Loudoun County, the normally conservative Senator Black made an emotional appeal for lawbreakers. I did support the senator from Franklin's bill. We missed the implications of that bill as contained here in the governor's amendment. So recognizing that it appears headed for passage, I hope the governor's watching and make some plans for how we're going to cover that $11 million to the trauma centers. And with that, we'll sit down, Mr. President.
Thank the senator. With the recommendation that it be rejected, the question is, shall the governor's recommendation regarding amendment number 33 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 30, noes 8.
Ayes 30, noes 8. The governor's recommendation is agreed to. Come to order.
Amendment number 23.
Senator from Augusta, Senator Hanger.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would first move that amendment number 23 pass, but I would ask the members to reject that and would speak to that.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. Amendment number 23 was the language that we originally included in the budget dealing with balanced billing. As you will note, we already have agreed to the governor's proposed amendment in amendment number 14, setting up a new work group to deal with the balanced budget amendment. And as you all, I think, are very much aware, there's a deep division between the parties to this issue on balanced budget billing. There's a certain constituency that is satisfied with the amendment we adopted for the study under Amendment number 14, but under Amendment number 23, I see no need now because there's another side that would like to see that study done as well. So I would propose basically to try to ameliorate this situation that we allow this study to go forward with the State Corporation Commission as well. So I would ask us to reject this amendment.
Thank the Senator. For what reason does the senior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Wagner, rise?
Yes, sir, Mr. President. Speaking to the amendment.
Senator's floor.
I would also ask that we reject this amendment. I think what we're looking for here is basically a couple of opinions from two different directions. There's nothing in either Amendment 14 or by rejecting this amendment that's going to change anything in the future other than provide next year's General Assembly more input in terms of how we deal with balance billing. I know that, particularly the senator from Fairfax City has relied heavily on the SEC. Some of their decisions, some he agrees with, some he doesn't. But this certainly gives the SEC and one executive department a chance to get together and take a look at this particular issue of balance billing and come back with recommendations to the General Assembly also. So basically, we're going to get input from a couple of sources as you all next year tackle the difficult issues with balance billing and how we're going to rein in health care costs. So I would hope that we would also reject this amendment.
Thank the Senator. For what purpose does the senior senator from Richmond City, Senator Sturdivant, rise?
Mr. President, I would ask that the body agree to the governor's amendment.
Senator's floor.
Thank you. In amendment number 14 that we've already agreed to, that is a very broad-based study that includes all of the stakeholders at the table. I think the issue with the study that is referenced in Amendment 23 is much narrower, and I think the governor is appropriate in removing that language so that we have that one study that has all the stakeholders at the table. We don't have redundancy and additional effort, and we do this in an efficient way, but in a way that makes sure that all of the stakeholders are involved in that process. And I'd ask that we agree and adopt Amendment 23.
For what purpose does the senator from Southern Fairfax, Senator Barker, rise?
Mr. President, to address the issues of Amendment 23 here.
The senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I concur with the senior senator from Richmond. I think it's appropriate to use Amendment 14 as the path that we take to help us deal with this particular issue. It is a much broader stakeholder group that is envisioned there, and I think that certainly if there's need for the State Corporation Commission to be involved in providing information, that can be worked out during the process rather than to establish two separate work groups, one of which is broad and one of which is narrow to address this issue. So I think that we should agree to this amendment from the governor.
Thank you, Senator. For what purpose, Senator from Bedford, Senator Newman, rise?
Mr. President, I'll be brief. Mr. President, I think that the senator from Virginia Beach and the senator from Richmond City both are correct, but I would reiterate what the senator from Augusta said. This is a very, very complex problem, and as you recall, all of us wanted to deal with balanced billing in some way, but between the two houses and within the bodies, we were unable to come to a conclusion. I would hope that what we could do is reject this, and if we do, we can actually have two reports, one coming from the State Corporation Commission and the agency, and then the more broad issue. I know this is an item that has some watching over the gallery on it, but I think the most prudent thing here for us to do would be to get the information from both sides, Mr. President.
Thank the senator. For what purpose does the senior senator from Chesapeake, Senator Cosgrove, rise?
Speak to the amendment, Mr. President.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I usually am like E.F. Hutton, or Senator Newman's like E.F. Hutton to me. Usually when he talks, I listen. And I've listened. But I just got an email from my emergency room doctor. And it says, John, hope you're well. If you could please vote on yes on 23, it would be appreciated. This is a guy who I go to when I really need him. I think it's important that we listen to, especially to the doctors dealing with this, Dr. Donovan. But I almost always go along with the recommendations from the senator from Augusta and the senator from Lynchburg. But on this case, I'm going to have to support the amendment. Thank you.
Senator, for what purpose is the junior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator D. Steph Rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the measure.
Senator, it's the floor.
And Mr. President, I tend to read things every once in a while, not all the time, but every once in a while. And if you look at measure budget amendment number 14, it actually already includes the SCC. So the SCC already has a seat at the table. So they are going to have their input. That's why I'm going to support the governor's amendment on this. Thank you.
Thank the senator. With the recommendation that it be rejected, the question is, shall the governor's recommendation on amendment number 23 be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk, close the roll.
Ayes 27, noes 10.
Ayes 27, noes 10. The governor's recommendation is agreed to.
Mr. President, inquiry of the clerk. Does that complete all the legislative matters that are on the calendar today?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. What purpose does the Senator from Russell, Senator Chafin, rise?
Mr. President, can we go back to the morning hour?
Without objection, we'll return to the morning hour.
Mr. President, I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you. So today, one of the things that I wanted to do and look forward to doing quite a bit today was honoring my friend, my colleague, my partner, Bill Carrico. And, Bill has been a great help to me. And we have been partners in many ways on many things with regard to this legislature. Bill Carrico has indicated that he is resigning, and as the body knows, there is going to be a new senator that will fill his seat. I doubt that they'll quite fill his shoes, and I mean that literally, because as you know, Senator Carrico is a man of large stature, and he is also a fairly serious-minded individual. I've noticed over the years, and so as you know, his seatmate, Senator Stanley, can be serious-minded, but lots of times he chooses not to be. So they make quite an odd couple there, I think. As we see things develop between the two of them. But I will say, Bill Carrico has a sense of humor, and I didn't really know how big it was until I became a member of this body and got to see it unfold. Today, also to honor Bill, his wife Paula and his daughter Emily, and his legislative aide Elijah, who is also his nephew, is here, and they've been patient and they've listened to all this stuff unfold all day long. And I'm not going to talk a long time, but I'm mindful that I'm driving further than the rest of you if I go home tonight. So whatever time that I take, it'll be added to my trip as well. Bill has driven thousands and thousands of miles in order to serve the people of Southwest Virginia. And when I think about Bill Carrico, I always think about certain words come to my mind, and those words, I jotted them down here, but honor and integrity
decency, moral fiber, a protector. He's a family man and a good family man. His church family is important to him. His spiritual beliefs are important to him. He's been a strong leader for Southwest Virginia for the 18 years that he's been here in the General Assembly. And he has supported the issues that mattered most to Southwest Virginia. And even sometimes, as we saw this particular session, things that he might not personally agree with, that he